Hello and welcome to another episode of American Psychonaut. I'm your host, Will Brenza, and this week we've got a really cool guest for you. He's an independent journalist living here in Colorado. His works appeared in Vice, New Scientist, and the Colorado Sun. He's an advocate, an activist, and of course, he's a psychotherapist with a very interesting story and powerful story about overcoming addiction with a recently decriminalized here in Colorado drug known as Ibogaine. Please welcome Kevin Franciotti. Kevin, cheers, man.
Will, cheers. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. It's really, dude, it's a breath of fresh air to have someone actually sitting in here with me instead of just talking at a computer screen.
It's amazing. 3 years into the pandemic, we're finally figuring it out.
Totally, man. Well, look, dude, I wanted to have you on the podcast for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I think you have a really cool story that a lot of people will be able to take some meaning from. But then second of all, I don't think a whole lot of people know like what Ibogaine is. I think we legalized it here in Colorado or decriminalized it, and a lot of Coloradans see the name on the list of substances and they kind of scratch their head and don't know like what it is or why we decriminalized it. So I guess let's start there. Like, what is Ibogaine?
And thanks for that question to start us off, Will. And I would say that my family probably wouldn't have called it such a cool story 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and neither would probably some members of the Nassau County Police Department, where I grew up in Long Island. But in all seriousness, as my adolescent rebellion, curiosity, experimentation, just kind of insecurity, deep repression and struggles to break out of my shell as I was ending high school and trying to move on to college, put me in a really devastating position and a very helpless position. So many years later, I'm sure we'll get back into the details of my story in a bit, but many years later, I had the opportunity to go to Mexico and receive Ibogaine treatment for what had become my opiate use disorder in 2011. And Ibogaine I had heard of growing up. Was certainly not taught to me during my DARE education or in health class or anything like that. But when I started experimenting with cannabis and I recognized immediately that I preferred that over alcohol, then I got curious about all sorts of things. So I found the website erowid.org, and the vault for Ibogaine was just like one of the things that I clicked through. And so I'm looking at this miraculous sounding plant called iboga that's indigenous to Western Equatorial Africa and the modern day countries of Gabon, Cameroon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it's this shrub that grows in the bush, in the jungle, and God knows how long ago, millennia ago. I mean, some tribal members of the Bwiti faith might claim that the iboga shrub has been around since the beginning of time, if not the beginning of human civilization. Sure. So in any event, this alkaloid known as Ibogaine, alkaloid meaning a naturally occurring chemical, exists in the root bark. And so, for thousands of years, the Bwiti tribes have been using iboga in sacramental purposes for communicating with ancestors, for healing ceremony, for all sorts of tribal pursuits. And there's a colonial history too with the French colonization branding Ibogaine as lambarine, which they marketed as a stimulant. There's a pretty fascinating history there. Okay. But in 1962, a young college student, a film major at NYU named Howard Lotsoff, was heroin addicted at the time, and he was also a psychonaut, and he just hung out with a group of people that liked to do drugs. So a chemist friend of his gave him a sample and just said, "You should try this. I think you'd like it." So completely unsuspecting any type of opiate withdrawal attenuation.
Interesting. Yeah.
He just took it and tripped, and 3 days later, which was part of the reason why he wanted to take it, he heard that it was like a multi-day trip.
Yeah.
Days later, he comes out of the experience realizing he hasn't used heroin in a few days, he hasn't experienced a lick of withdrawal, and he has no craving for it.
Wow.
So that's
wild.
Kind of the origin story of Ibogaine.
That's really interesting. I had never heard that. I'd heard like some of its like history as like a tribal substance that was used kind of as a like coming of age, like rite of passage kind of drug. But that makes that makes perfect sense. And it's very interesting that like it's kind of Western history started with someone who experienced, relief of their addiction symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with psychedelics. Like LSD has that serendipitous discovery story
Right,
with Albert
yeah.
Hoffman, accidentally, a careful chemist accidentally spilling a little bit of liquid on his arm and it absorbing, which is what cops think fentanyl does, which it doesn't to this day. That's just a little bit of a cheeky aside. But, Ibogaine and other medicines have that strange origin story in some ways. But unlike a lot of the other psychedelics, the use of and the awareness of Ibogaine in the West kind of was immediately founded upon this miraculous quality of helping overcome opiate addiction.
Well, that seems like a good place to kind of rewind or fast forward, I guess, depending on how you look at it. But tell me about your story, man. Like, how did you come into contact with Ibogaine in your life, and what difference did it make for you in your situation?
Yeah, I mean, as a bored suburban kid growing up in Long Island, really having no interest in any of the types of jobs or studies that were kind of being presented to me growing up, I really had no idea where I wanted to go to college. I made, a pretty shitty decision based on just the geographic location of Northeastern being far enough away from New York where I grew up, but being close enough that if I wanted to come home, I could. Like, that was the basis of my decision, so that my parents could pay tens of thousands of dollars on an undergrad. So I wasn't in a great frame of mind to be making mature, consequential decisions. But by then, I had become fascinated in psychedelics, and some of my first mushroom experiences really showed me that there was something way beyond recreational bliss
Right.
And euphoria to receive in those experiences. Actually, my first real understanding of the effects of mushrooms was a strong desire to run home and hug my parents and tell them I love them. Thankfully, I did not.
I'm familiar with the feeling. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, thankfully, I didn't wind up doing that until hours later. But in any event, because of those experiences, because of my boredom and disinterest with other mainstream avenues, I sought that studiously, academically, professionally, in whatever way that I could do it. But I was also someone who wasn't managing their life very well. I had severe cannabis use disorder. I had severe anxiety and depression. I had a violent assault when I was 16 that left me pretty traumatized. And so when I was in college, I just wanted to figure out any way that I could to work with these compounds, in the so-called psychedelic renaissance. And it just so happened at the time that there was a trial going on looking at MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for dying cancer patients at Harvard's McLean Psychiatric Hospital. So I landed there right as the first clinical trial participant was going through the full protocol. And so as a 19, 20-year-old, I felt like, oh my gosh, I've arrived. There was not an abundance of research like there is going on right now. So this was 2007, 2008.
Okay, yeah.
And then on campus, I was also trying to organize a student group. I wanted to, I was actually asked to host an Ibogaine conference at Northeastern as a result of some of the connections that I was making on this Harvard study.
Okay.
And so this guy asked me if we could host it. I couldn't find a single academic department to express any interest in it. I couldn't really find a student group to be willing to ask for funding. And so I started a student group on my own in order to host it. It was a chapter of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, a national nonprofit student advocacy organization.
Very cool, man.
Mainly, thank you. Mainly to sponsor this Ibogaine conference. So in 2009, over President's Day weekend, that's really where I was seriously introduced to it, and not just introduced to the medicine, the history, the science, but also the community, right? There were researchers, treatment providers, people who received healing from it as well. And so that was really my deep immersive dive into the world of Ibogaine, going on 15 years ago at this point.
Wow, man. And so was that before you had used it to treat your issues with addiction?
Yes, and oddly enough, these two events weren't really connected, but weeks after the conference is when I picked back up on opiate experimentation. I had tried it a couple times in high school, a friend stealing some from his mom's medicine cabinet and sharing it with me at school, and getting some prescribed for my wisdom teeth, that kind of thing. Except even at that age, when I was prescribed it for my wisdom teeth, I knew that if I skipped a meal, I would really feel it, right? If I took it as prescribed, I would just get rid of pain. And yeah, I want to play video games and hang out and dick around. So I would be on an empty stomach when my mom would dispense a pill, and then I'd actually feel the high. But nothing really stuck until years later, and it just happened to coincide weeks after this Ibogaine conference that I really started taking opiates.
Interesting. More serendipity there.
Not the best kind, but thankfully it all worked out in the end.
Yeah. So how long did you struggle with addiction before you ended up deciding, like, I need to go try this?
Something that I'm pretty grateful for is that I really didn't have that much time to spend on that. In 2010, I had been slowly worsening the severity of my OxyContin use, just going from, licking off the time release coating so that it would be more potent if you swallowed it, to then chewing it, to then breaking it down and snorting it. So it took me a year to get to the point where I was like really having a habit. And then even at that point, I actually went to a MAPS conference, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, that just put on this big conference here in Denver. I went to their 2010 conference fully opiate addicted. And I had a wild experience there where I actually lost my bag of drugs. And here I was at this conference around like my idols, my network, and I'm trying to, become part of this field. And I'm freaking out because I'm going to be in opiate withdrawal. A wild story. I actually, on the train to the airport, found a pill on the ground, and like any good addict, I pocketed it.
Of course, yeah.
And I didn't think about it until I lost my bag of oxycodone. I pulled it out, I Googled it. It was a 10 milligram methadone. And methadone, for people that don't know, is a medication used for the treatment of opiate addicts. It's also not the kind of thing that you generally find lying around.
Sure.
And so that was like a gift from God. And 10 milligrams was certainly not enough to get me high. I took it the next day and I coasted through the rest of my time in California without experiencing withdrawal. But a couple of weeks when I got back, I started using again. And within a month, I actually got arrested. I was acutely psychotic from injecting cocaine and heroin, and I got arrested shoplifting. And as a result of my belligerence and my uncooperative state with law enforcement, they charged me with a felony. But as a result of privileged family resources, I was able to, have a meeting with a private attorney who basically said, look, you got to go to rehab, you got to go to outpatient, you got to get on buprenorphine, another medication for opiate use disorder, and live in a halfway house for a year. Otherwise, you're probably going to get a felony and you might do jail time. So not exactly the type of state to inspire transformation, right? It was mostly like a coercive type of thing that I either had the choice to surrender to or keep on fighting.
That's very interesting, because I think that a lot of people end up in that point where it's like they're not actively necessarily seeking out the help themselves, but they kind of need to be nudged in the right direction.
Yeah, and that happens sadly to a lot of young people and people who are going through that phase of life where you are figuring yourself out, and not always in the safest, most elegant ways. And we really, as a society, fail to equip young people with how to do drugs more safely.
Right. Yeah.
How to navigate the world in a way where you're going to make mistakes, but not cast you to the wolves. So that was, the context for which I was basically, told you either do this or you're screwed. So
and did your mind immediately go to Ibogaine?
It didn't, oddly enough. And it was likely because of the experience being in custody. The police roughed me up when I was in handcuffs and did not treat me like a human being. And so I was so disoriented, so kind of traumatized, also still coming down off of this really bad high, that I was just like, hey, you tell me where to go, and I guess I'm going to go, but I'm going to try to figure out how to get high while I'm doing it.
Right.
So in the summer of 2010, which was the year I was supposed to be graduating my undergrad, I went to a traditional abstinence-based 12-step oriented addiction treatment center. And it did not work. And so after leaving that facility, I started using again. 10 months later, the complete opposite type of intervention, far more loving, much more compassionate, much more holistic, came from my mom. And she just went into my bedroom one night thinking I hadn't left in days. And I'd just been sneaking out at night to go score and then sleep all day. So she came in my room and said, what's going on? Do you need help? And for some ability that I can't really define as coming from myself, I just opened my mouth and started talking and said, I need help. And I think Ibogaine might help me this time.
Wow, man. Was your mom like hesitant at all at the idea of using, like, you engaging in a clinic and a form of therapy that used one drug to treat an addiction to another drug, or was she kind of open to it at that point?
To her credit, she was pretty open-minded in terms of initially just hearing me out.
Yeah.
And I qualified my desire to go take Ibogaine with being open myself to doing those things that my lawyer had recommended that I had rejected.
Right.
I said, I will get on a plane from the clinic to South Florida and live in a halfway house and get a job, go to meetings, do all the things that I'm supposed to do. And she didn't decide right away. She wanted to talk it over with my father. But the next morning she came in and that was actually the selling point. If she was trying to be sold on something, but
right.
She was willing to tolerate her goofball son that she was fearing she might lose and say, you know what, like, because you were willing to do something I know you don't want to do, we will be willing to pay for this treatment for you.
That's pretty incredible, and props to your mom for that, man, because I know there's a lot of parents out there. Mine are a perfect example, would probably be a little hesitant to let me go engage in that kind of therapy, but like, also, when it's somebody you love and they're grasping for a solution too, like I understand where she came from there. That's props for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so walk me through kind of like once you got there, what the process was, and then up to like taking the plant.
So there's a disclaimer that I want to preface this with what's happening right now in psychedelics is very exciting and needs to be understood that the infrastructure is not quite there yet, right? We have these remarkable results from clinical trials. We have training going on for a generation of psychotherapists to be facilitators. We have medical and safety guidelines that are coming online, but psychedelics still kind of remain a little bit of the Wild West when it comes to recreational drugs, or drugs that have been labeled recreational drugs that have only been embraced for their medical and breakthrough qualities now. Ibogaine is sort of like the Wild West of psychedelics. And
certainly, yeah.
So at the time there was almost no standardization in the protocols. It was kind of a loose patchwork of, in many cases, former addicts who received treatment themselves that went on to start up clinics.
Okay.
So I'm not, claiming that these are people with ill intentions, but it's not exactly the most robust kind of medically supported types of community efforts here. So there's just people doing their best, trying to bring healing into the world. So when I went to Mexico, I had to go on a leap of faith. I had to get a ride to the airport without any drugs on me, because I wasn't going to risk getting arrested trying to go to treatment. So I did my last bag like hours before leaving for the plane. And I land in San Diego to wait for the guy to pick me up, having nothing on me, having no connections in San Diego, and certainly having no motivation to try to fuck things up yet again. So he picks me up. We actually stopped at a Whole Foods parking lot so that he can get paperwork from a PI, a principal investigator of an Ibogaine trial. There was a MAPS-sponsored Ibogaine study going on at the time. And me, I'm a psychonaut. Like I felt like a total failure. I was bottomed out, and I still yet believed in the cause of the psychedelic renaissance, and I believed that I would wind up back there. So when it became offered for me to enroll in this trial, I thought, well, there's some motivation for me to actually provide good data to a study. So as strange as it is, as nerdy as it is, it was also very good timing for me. So we get to the clinic, and one of the things that's important for people to understand about Ibogaine is, unlike most other psychedelics, Ibogaine can be fatal and has been fatal.
Yeah.
It is not like playing Russian roulette. It's not just bad luck of the draw. You wind up being the one who gets killed. It's generally because people have pre-existing heart conditions. The lifestyle behaviors of many of the people going for Ibogaine treatment are largely drug addicted, so they're really not taking good care of themselves, diet and nutrition. Sometimes they're sneaking their drugs of choice up until the moment where they're actually receiving Ibogaine. So it's things like that that put people's lives really at risk. So I say that to say when I got there, I was introduced to a nurse who'd be taking care of me and monitoring me throughout my stay. They did a little physical exam just to make sure I was generally in good health. They took labs to see my liver function. They ran an EKG to measure the electrical rhythm of my heart and determine whether I was a good candidate for Ibogaine's unique cardiac effects. So Ibogaine is known to prolong the QT interval of the electrical rhythm of the heart. And if you are taking extra medications, like you're sneaking drugs, and it prolongs it even more, you run the risk of putting yourself into cardiac arrest. That's only one of the many medical considerations to follow. Mm-hmm. But thankfully, like, I felt safe. I knew that these people knew the medical safety and knew the risks, and I believed them when they screened me and determined that I was a good fit for this medicine. So it was very clinical. I really, at the time, wasn't interested in ceremony. I wasn't interested in some kind of Africanized, healing ritual. I just was broken, desperate, and willing to try anything. And thankfully, I knew a lot about it. And I actually had a friend from college work at the clinic who showed up after my treatment. So they bring me to my room. They tell me I'm going to fast for the rest of the day because my treatment will be that night. They run an IV bag of nutrients through my system. They keep the IV line in case I need to be administered any types of rescue medication or an antiemetic if I start having a vomiting spell. And then the nurse basically, sits in the bed, in the bed next to my bed, and kind of gets some sleep while also, keeping one eye open to make sure my pulse ox doesn't, go haywire and something he needs to be responded to. And then the clinic director came in, and he administered what's called a flood dose of Ibogaine. It's roughly around 12 to 14 milligrams per kilogram of body weight.
Okay, interesting. So it's intravenous that they...
No, it was with capsules. Yeah,
with capsules.
Okay.
Okay.
But good clarification. So, he ingested it with capsules. I was on an empty stomach, and there was about 3 capsules total after the first kind of test dose, just to make sure I didn't have an allergic response to it.
Is it just like the powdered shrub, or is it like extracted?
So Ibogaine is mostly used in clinics for addiction treatment as a semi-synthetic extraction from the Voacanja genus of plants. So that's a much more abundant plant source. It's not very rich in Ibogaine alkaloids, but wild-grown iboga is endangered, and it's protected, actually. So the Gabonese government restricts its exportation, except for in licensed applications and uses, because they want to prioritize the tribal use of it.
Sure, yeah.
And so most of the Ibogaine that people get in clinics are from this alternative extraction. And so that's the medicine that I received. It just looked like a white crystal powder kind of thing, encapsulated. So I was administered the capsules. I was told to listen for kind of a buzzing sound, and that would sort of signal the start of my experience. I was like, whatever, man. I want to feel better. I'm starting to get into withdrawal. So about an hour later, I'm like laying on my side, and I hear what sounds like landscaping equipment outside the window. And I'm like, what the hell is that? I'm like, it's 10 p.m. I'm on the Baja California coastline. What is going on? Oh, right. That must be the buzzing. And as soon as I recognized that, I felt a total eruption in euphoria just emanating from the center of my chest and permeating, flowing all throughout my body. And for someone in opiate withdrawal at the stage that I was at, I was maybe having a little bit of flop sweat, maybe some restlessness, a little anxiety. That was not going to be the worst that I had in store for me. So to know that I was suddenly receiving relief was profound, and not the kind of relief that, getting drunk might provide you. This was like a true, I know I'm in withdrawal, but I feel so good that I don't really care. And then as this feeling physically is coming over me, that I also had the intuition that it was going to last for a while. I had heard Ibogaine last for a while. I knew this feeling was going to last for a while. I had my eyes closed, and in my mind's eye, I was just sort of, my consciousness, my awareness, whatever you want to call it, was catapulted through this wormhole and this like oscilloscope thing of outer space was just prominent on my mind. And I was like, okay, cool. Now I'm going to have a rad psychedelic experience in addition to being treated for opiate withdrawal. And I stayed there for like 10 to 12 hours, having incredible visions, very, very fast. I was also hearing, like, I wasn't listening to any music, and yet I was hearing this kind of rapid percussive type thing, which of course I did associate with the African tribal drumming. It was kind of irresistible. But the visions that I had were not really the types that I necessarily expected to have as someone struggling with addiction. I thought I would be getting like finger wagging kind of stuff and like a stern talking to from a loving grandfather, but still like you're going to get smacked on the ass a little bit.
Right, yeah.
I had a loving time, like basically feeling as if I was navigating a spaceship through the psyche of me, and thinking and having thoughts that I felt like they were things that I used to think about as a kid, just like innocent things where you're coming to understand yourself and what it's like to be alive. And I was basically falling in love with myself. And again, as a person struggling with addiction, rock bottom, college dropout, unemployable, living with my parents, it wasn't an arrogant type of thing. It wasn't a self-righteous thing. It was a very humble, like, dude, you should love yourself. You're a pretty fucking awesome dude. And that's not the kind of treatment that you get at a typical mainstream detox. It's certainly not the experience that I had in rehab.
That's really interesting. I have only ever heard that Ibogaine produces a terrifying like trip. Like it feels like an elephant sitting on your chest and you're being confronted with visions from your past. And that runs contrary to everything I've heard so far.
Yeah, I've heard the same. And I've often wondered, like, why was I lucky? Or, there were things that I've also heard about Ibogaine that I didn't quite experience. There's this, the life review, they call it, where you see this rapid succession of almost like film frames going too quickly to actually notice what's going on in the scene. But almost like a flip book, you kind of get the sense of what the story is. And people have described that as living through their whole life in the blink of an eye, and being confronted with things like trauma or just relationships that have come and gone, grief, pain, things like that. Right, yeah. But yeah, my experience was very benevolent for that phase.
It sounds like a really cool psychedelic experience. I mean, a useful one, and one in a challenging point in your life, but that does sound beautiful in the psychedelic sense.
It didn't stay that way the whole time. Ibogaine is known to have multiple phases. So that first phase, especially with Ibogaine, unlike Iboga tends to come on more gradually, and you're being dosed much more spread apart to get to that flood dose state that they call it.
Okay.
With Ibogaine, you're kind of just getting brought there quickly, and the onset of the effects happen rapidly. And so with that, there's also a rapid drop off when those peak effects wear off. And because of the timing with my opiate withdrawal, I kind of, dope fiended the facilitator a little bit. He was like, wait until your withdrawal symptoms are at their worst before we give you the medicine. And I was like, oh man, they're so bad. They're terrible. Just give me it right now. Had I waited like another 12 hours, I probably would have coasted through the whole thing without being in withdrawal. So the physical effects wear off, and I'm still in withdrawal. Okay. Now I'm feeling it. And another thing associated with Ibogaine is most people understand that it's supposed to, coast you through the whole time. Maybe I should have been given a booster. Again, as I prefaced this before, people just kind of use their own approach, and maybe a different clinic would have given me a booster that I would have floated through without any withdrawal. But with my experience, it was hard to be in that state, because when you're in that state, in withdrawal, you want to get high. You're craving. You want the agony of it, the anguish to end, and the way that is a guaranteed way to make it end is to fix. But I'm also an hour south of Tijuana in the middle of nowhere, having no way of getting out and finding anything. So I knew that I was basically strapped in for the day. And I'm coming down off this powerful psychedelic experience, which, as many people know, is the afterglow, right? Mm-hmm. You're emotionally vulnerable. You're incredibly sensitive. You're introspective and reflecting. And that's when the sort of the price of admission for like the psychedelic roller coaster ride that I had gotten was punched, and I was flooded with guilt and remorse and regret and shame and all things like that, while being acutely sensitive to it. And ultimately, it was like a dark night of the soul type encounter. Sure, yeah. But it proved to be very humbling and transformative. It didn't exactly inspire a ton of willingness in me to completely kick my addiction and leave it behind. I was tempted to make plans to do something that went against what I had bargained with my mom over. Mm-hmm. But after a couple of phone calls with some other family members, I was my mind was swiftly changed, and I decided to go ahead and keep up my end of the bargain.
That's something I definitely wanted to ask you about, was just that idea that like Ibogaine's not like a solution. You take it and it's done, right? Like, how much of it, in your opinion, is kind of like the drug, but then the other side, how much of it is your will to get better? Like, you want to get better, and you have to sort of ignore these compulsions and fight the addiction.
And that's the kind of $1 billion question is, how do we know who's ready? How do we know who really wants it? There's really, since the 60s, since Howard Lotsof discovered this, and since he went on basically his lifelong crusade to try to get anyone to take him seriously and explore this empirically, Ibogaine has remained this kind of underground sort of, a metaphor here is escaping me, but it's almost like this urban legend, or had been for many decades among addicts, that was like, hey, you can take this African drug that'll cure you, right? And nowadays, the way that addiction treatment has become predominant in this country, which remains a heavily moralized, stigmatized thing that is often assigned abstinence as the main solution for it. At best, you might get on medications that will keep you alive, but for many people, not really help them break through to a recovery lifestyle. So the types of people that come to Ibogaine are those that have had unsuccessful past treatments. Mm-hmm. Not many people that I know have sought out Ibogaine as their first stop, right? Even myself, I wasn't addicted for very long. I had only one real treatment episode, and then Ibogaine was kind of the second one that I went through. So what I would be incredibly fascinated to see, if we get to that point, would be for the first-time intervention for people, would this actually work for them? It's not as widely known that Howard Lotsof had a group of friends that he would like to share things with, and many of the other friends that were addicted tried Ibogaine, and it didn't work for them. It didn't provide that transformation. So Ibogaine, for me, knowing that I had to follow up, knowing that I had to commit to the 7 months in South Florida, was not appealing to me, but it provided me the open-mindedness to live up to my end of the bargain and see it through, and actually like give it a college try and take it seriously, and not just go through the motions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that's usually the hardest part for people who are struggling with addiction, is like taking that step to like do something about it and to commit to actually making themselves better. And, I've been fairly close to some situations where I've had people just straight up tell me like, God, I wish I could make him go to an Ibogaine clinic. I wish I could just make him go. But like, at a certain point, like, yes, that will help, but you got to want to get better too, I think.
Yeah, there's a really terrible therapy joke that says, how many psychotherapists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Have you heard at all about the non-psychedelic Ibogaine that they're trying to develop? So what are your thoughts on that, man?
So, I mean, I'm all for anything that might work. because as we're saying, even Ibogaine, this so-called like holy grail, the mecca of psychedelics, especially for opiate addicts, might not work for everybody. So we need as many options on the table as we have. I mean, we're now losing well over 100,000 people every year to opiate-related overdoses, and those are just the ones that are documented, right? It's the real number is probably far more. So we need as much as we can get. So there's a couple of lines of inquiry. There's a recent discovery of a supposedly non-psychoactive analog known as Tabernanthe log. There was a long-standing compound called 18-MC, stands for 18-methoxycoronarinine. So there's been these efforts to take the trip out of Ibogaine while still keeping intact the anti-craving effects, the anti-withdrawal effects. There's also nor-Ibogaine. So we're really not far along yet in the drug development process for that. And there is actually some question over whether these compounds are really non-psychoactive. And at the right dose, it could be. It could start to see that activity. And we just don't know yet. But I think fundamentally what we need is to have many tools in the toolkit. And this conversation so far, and most of our conversations on addiction, focus so heavily on opiates, but there's a massive stimulant problem. Alcohol continues to kill many Americans every year, hundreds of thousands. So we focus a lot on opiates. Opiates have several therapeutics that are known to be useful. So one of Ibogaine's unique pharmacological effects, in addition to not really knowing its mechanism of action, we don't really know why it does many of the things that it does. It's a very pharmacologically messy substance. It has activity all over the brain, which the FDA doesn't, and drug developers don't really like. They like to own in on what specific thing is something doing that we can isolate. Ibogaine is going all over the place. And one of the things that it seems to do is actually activate some growth factors that might repair or in some cases even grow new dopaminergic pathways. They've demonstrated this with animal models, which is a promising breakthrough, not just for addiction, things like stimulant addiction, which will ravage the brain, especially the dopamine pathway, but also for certain neurological conditions and traumatic brain injury. So, the Bwiti, the Gabonese people, the many adherents to the ceremonial style of it, they kind of scoff at the notion that iboga has this association with the treatment of addiction. When it beyond the medical applications, the applications that it can be used for spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally are so profound that we really need to expand our scope with it.
Yeah, interesting. It's funny you take a drug like that out of its cultural context and realize like people start using it for medicine and stuff, and the people who have raised this over the centuries are looking at it and saying like, what are you doing? That's not how you use it, or that's not what you use it for.
And you're taking it from us and making it something different, and then you're also not being in reciprocity with where it comes from, not only the people but also the land. I mean, Africa and its modern history is just ripe with extractivism from the dominant global countries, and so there's a fascinating UN doctrine called the Nagoya Protocol, which the country of Gabon has signed on to, not exclusively, but to prioritize also the endangered protection of Ibogaine. So it's this set of guidelines that are designed to encourage, if not bind, companies that are researching Ibogaine to give back to the Gabonese people, to give back to these communities in recognition that they've been stewarding this medicine for thousands of years.
Yeah, that kind of stuff needs to be thought about and taken into account as we approach this new era of like legalized natural medicines. It's something I know has come up as an issue here in Colorado with mescaline. Some of the peyote churches are not excited that we're now sort of appropriating this drug from their religion and using it as a medicine for our own context. And I know there's been some groups that have even pushed to have mescaline prohibited here in Colorado, even though we just legalized it for the same kinds of reasons. I mean, it's also endangered, you know.
Yeah, and that's one of the, I came to Colorado 3 years ago, so it was after the Denver's successful initiative of lowering the prioritization of psilocybin and then the statewide effort. And so I was a little confused when I first got here, and I saw a lot of infighting among the psychedelic advocates, which I'm still kind of confused and bothered by, even now learning much more about it, because I'm an idealist and the drug war yesterday, right? Like when it comes to, obviously, respecting tribal cultures, respecting the will and the wishes of tribal cultures, we see this with the federal protections for peyote among certain tribes, and nobody is advocating to put people in jail. As far as I know, nobody is really saying that, but the fact that if it is in a certain restrictive category of drug prohibition, it does protect access to these tribes. So I understand the nuance to it, and thankfully in the campaign there was an effort where this community advocacy was listened to, and so the architects of Prop 122 and then the legislature that implemented it with SB 290 removed mescaline extracted from peyote. And peyote is not a protected class among the 5 compounds that were legalized, but it's challenging. And for me, I want, quite frankly, the psychedelic reform that we're seeing to kind of be a Trojan horse for all drug reform. And we need to decriminalize, we need to provide access to through legitimate channels to regulated, pure doses. I'm not an expert on what that looks like, so the details need to be ironed out, but it's very clear since the 1970s that the war on drugs is an abysmal failure, and it ought to deserve the time and attention to figure out a different way that doesn't have, as I said, hundreds of thousands of people dying every year.
It's I mean, I bring it up and people say it's a radical and impossible idea, but I do truly think that decriminalizing all substances is it's the solution that's sitting right there on the table in front of everybody. Like, take all this money we're spending to fight the drug war and put people in jail and keep them there for decades, and reroute that into treatment and research and figuring out how does Ibogaine actually affect the brain, and building these centers and clinics that can actually administer therapy in a way that's going to help people in mass. That to me seems like a more realistic, albeit maybe it does sound radical, legalize all drugs, but also legalize them in a way where we're putting that effort to fight a drug war into helping people get better and making the drugs safer and figuring out the true mechanisms. It all seems to come back to mental health to me, so many of the issues in this country, the big issues, drug addiction, homelessness, all these things all end up getting tied back to mental health issues. And here we now have this opportunity in Colorado where we've legalized all of these things, and suddenly we can start doing the work and showing people there's potential here. We can solve these problems just by getting to the root of them. And actually, there are some substances we can use that help us get to the root a little bit faster.
And I think you put the nail on the head when you said we got to get to work, right? We passed this legislation, we passed this ballot initiative, and then we came out as a community to make sure that the spirit of the law remained intact with the implementation bill. But now the work has started. Right now, the license, not just the regulated access, but now the communities that have long been operating in the underground have legal protections that they can be more open about. Mm-hmm. Now is the time where we need to have public education campaigns. We need to get into more mainstream channels of society, school board meetings, high school age kids, to educate them. We've seen how some of this stuff has played out with cannabis, and it hasn't all gone well. We've had plenty of trouble with it, but in comparison to what we've been operating under for the decades prior to a law like this, clearly we have a better path that we've long known about. I'm sure you were going to ask me about this, but it's also a pretty good segue to highlight what just happened in Kentucky. In Kentucky's Opiate Abatement Commission, so the team of bureaucrats basically assembled by the Attorney General's office after they received settlement funds from, the demonized companies blamed for perpetuating the opioid crisis. You got Purdue Pharma, McKesson, and some others. They have, almost $1 billion in individual states have received, in some cases, almost $1 billion of funding to streamline into addiction treatment, harm reduction. So one of the commissioners, a guy named Brian Hubbard, found out about Ibogaine maybe a year or so ago and took the time to study it, talked to all the advocates, and then basically advocated for a very small percentage of the pool of their money to go to looking at the development of Ibogaine for the treatment of opiate use disorder. I mean, in Kentucky, of all places, if rural Appalachia is figuring this out, Colorado ought to take a lesson from that, because we're not going to be able to do the work without the funding.
Right.
And we're not going to want the funding to come from a private pharmaceutical company focused on their bottom line, patenting everything, and then having a monopoly on this space. We need to come out as a community to figure out how to support the best way forward.
Yeah, it's a huge opportunity here in Colorado, and like you said, man, as with cannabis, like there will be growing pains. There will be things that we're going to figure out that work and things that work better. But like, I think the chance that we have here, especially with the therapeutic focus of the legalization movement here, is so big, because suddenly it seems like Colorado's like become a laboratory almost. Like we now will be able to start like doing all of this, not experimentation, but work with people where we're getting to the bottom of these answers. Like, how do these things work? What kinds of ailments can they help treat? What kind of issues can they help treat? Like, it's just super exciting to me, man. I'm excited to see what happens with it.
Yeah, and shout out to Jeff Hunt with Colorado Christian University. He invited me on to debate him about Prop 122 back in September.
Oh, all right.
And he gave me shit for saying that Colorado is like the leader of progressive drug policy reform. And to you're putting it very realistically, saying that we're kind of a testing ground to see how this will play out. We're going to become under a lot of scrutiny. We've seen what's been happening in Oregon. They passed 2 ballot initiatives during the last presidential election to decriminalize all drugs and create a civil infraction so that it would fund harm reduction services. And we've seen some issues shaking out with implementing that. And there's also been some criticism of their Measure 109, which was the preceding reform that legalized psilocybin through licensed facilitation. The costs are very expensive. The regulations are very cumbersome. But these things have just happened. We've had decades of the war on drugs, which for decades we've been saying isn't working. It's hemorrhaging money. The DEA can't be trusted, and people are dying, and drugs are more available and dangerous than they ever have. So we need a little bit of time to figure out how these reforms are going to best work, and we need to trust the public health experts.
Yeah, it's going to be a few years of trial and error, I think, and then also like a matter of just pushing education, having more of these like psychedelic science seminars and like psychedelic recovery summits. Like you're going to host one on October 1st?
Yeah, virtual conference on October 1st covering topics related to people in addiction recovery, behavioral addiction, substance-related addiction, friends, family, and loved ones, practitioners. We're going to have panels of folks that have figured out their own way, like me, to receive an alternative healing strategy involving psychedelics, in some cases continuing to go on and intentionally use psychedelics to further instill their recovery efforts. There's also, a Colorado organization right here along the Front Range known as the knack Society that hosts meetings in Denver, Fort Collins, Boulder, and I think Colorado Springs. They have at the Mercury Cafe in Denver on August 3rd as their next meeting. Maybe not in time for this podcast for your listeners to hear, but
it's okay. Shout out to NOAC anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's the thing about Prop 122, the thing about the Natural Medicine Health Act that has been so inspiring is this prioritization of community healing and how it's not providing a simple, streamlined path for any one company to come in once FDA gives the approval on a therapeutic to really have the monopoly. We are protecting community healing groups to figure out ways to facilitate this, whether it's through a psychedelic church, whether it's through an addiction recovery community, whether it's through just any type of kind of neighborhood community effort of people, couples getting together, trying to fix their marriages, or, just being better family members and parents. There's the New York-based Planned Parenthood group that advocates for,
cool.
Psychedelic integration for parents.
Yeah. That's it, man. It's those kinds of seminars and events, like education at this point, I think is probably our best tool for making this grand experiment in the psychedelic renaissance like really work and play out in our best favor and in everybody's best favor. Because I think if we can prove it works here, everybody else will follow suit. It happened with cannabis. It's going to happen with this. And like, man, the possibilities for that are like, they just seem endless to me. Like, it really does seem like this could change society here in the U.S. as we know it.
And it's not without its potential dark side too. And as we've talked about it, as grandiose as the hopes are, as utopian
Certainly.
as we want to see, for concerned people out there, the risks are real.
Yeah.
Question the Facebook ads that you see about mailing you a 3-month supply of ketamine.
For sure.
Don't necessarily think that the person on your college campus is selling pure things, or the intentions that people bring in to experience some kind of healing. We have to be mindful as adults, as people pioneering this field, that leave it to humans to fuck up a good thing. And so we need to be, on our watch for kids, getting out of hand, giving them the right information so that they can be careful, make smart decisions, and make mistakes that are not going to be life-threatening, because that's the way that they learn.
Absolutely, man. And it's education, but then also like training programs to help people, therapists who want to get the right kind of training. You mentioned before we had this conversation, there's a company, Skylight Psychedelics. They're launching a ketamine or Ibogaine training.
So Skylight Psychedelics is a national psychedelic training and ketamine prescribing company, co-founded by Dr. Dana Lehrman and Scott Bienenfeld. Is an addiction psychiatrist. She's a former infectious disease specialist. So they do prescribing for ketamine to be used in conjunction with psychotherapy in every state in the country. And then they're also a training program and an experiential program for therapists interested in having some of their own experiences. They can come to Colorado and have a direct experience. They do online training modules, and one of their upcoming programs is going to be with Ibogaine later this fall.
Yeah, that's really exciting, man. That's going to be a lot of the industry, is these training programs and companies that are going to be licensing people. I'm really excited to see all of that kind of evolve and build and grow. It's cool. It feels to me like we're standing on the precipice of great change. Like you said, there's a light side and a dark side to it, as with everything, but I don't know. Change, in my experience, tends to play out well, especially when the change is something like ending a prohibition that has needed to be ended for 50, 60 years and will potentially help like thousands of people. Like, that's a change I'm ready to leap into, man.
I gave my mom a shout out earlier, and just to bring her back up again, as a high schooler, as a troublemaker, rebellious kid, drug enthusiast, I'd have these discussions with her where I was like, Mom, like, I know this sounds crazy, and I know they've been talking about legalizing marijuana, forever from when you were growing up. But I really think that there's something promising happening here. And yet I was still under the impression that I'd have way more gray hairs than I do before I would actually see something change. So it's been incredibly inspiring to be here at this point with bringing my experience as both a cautionary tale, but also an informed expertise to give advice to policymakers, to train a new generation of therapists, to provide access to treatment and healing from patients that have been failed by the mainstream treatment industries. I brought up the psychedelic conference that we just had here in Denver. Over 12,000 people showed up to this conference, and it was very gratifying for me personally, because it was the first psychedelic conference that I had been to in a stable place and not having a problematic relationship with substances. And we were hosting recovery meetings for people that are interested in integrating psychedelics at 7 a.m. in this conference. And we had over 50 people showing up each day.
So awesome.
So I was brought to tears just knowing that people trying to navigate a slippery slope can still do that in a supportive and safe way and talk about it and be held by their peers.
Yeah, man, it's a brave new world. It's
Indeed.
an exciting time to be alive.
Right on.
Kevin, where can people find you if they want to follow you or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm pretty active, except maybe not anymore on Twitter or X or whatever the fuck Elon is trying to destroy it
Right.
with now. At Kevin Franciotti, I'm on LinkedIn, and you can find me on Instagram at KF Counseling, and my website is kevinfranciotticounseling.com.
Perfect. Awesome. Kevin, thank you so much for coming in today, dude. I really appreciated your time.
Thanks for having me, man.
Of course. Bye, everybody.